For 3 whole decades, Northern Ireland was caught in this brutal low-level war we now call the Troubles. It was a relentless cycle of bombings, assassinations, and bitter street battles. But one day, just one single afternoon, stands out as a turning point that changed absolutely everything. So, how does that even happen? How does a protest for something as fundamental as civil rights spiral into a full-blown massacre? That's the question we're going to dive into today. We're going to break down the anatomy of what became known as Bloody Sunday, looking not just at what happened, but at the deep, deep divisions that made it possible, and the unresolved legacy that, honestly, still haunts Northern Ireland to this day. So our story starts right here, in Londonderry, or Derry, as it's known to nationalists. In January 1972, this was a city just simmering. It was a pressure cooker of tension, a real flashpoint in a society that was already split right down the middle. To really get what happened on that Sunday, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to understand the world it happened in. You see, this wasn't some sudden, out-of-the-blue explosion. No, this was the result of pressure that had been building and building for decades. At its very core, the whole conflict was driven by this fundamental split over one big question: what country do we belong to? On one side, you had the Unionists. They were mainly Protestant, and they were determined to remain part of the United Kingdom. On the other side, you had Nationalists. They were mainly Catholic, and their goal was a united Ireland. And this wasn't just politics, you know? It was woven into the very fabric of society, breeding deep distrust in institutions like the police and fueling the rise of armed paramilitary groups on both sides. Now, into this already explosive environment, the government took some pretty drastic steps. They brought in something called internment, which basically meant they could imprison suspected paramilitaries without even putting them on trial. And they banned all public marches. But here's the kicker. Internment was used almost exclusively against the nationalist community, so for them, it didn't feel like a security measure at all. It felt like state-sponsored oppression. And the March on Bloody Sunday, well, it was a direct protest against that very policy. And that brings us to the day itself. So now we're going to zoom in, right? We're moving from that big, complicated picture to the minute-by-minute decisions and the split-second actions that turned a protest march into an absolute tragedy. Now, what's really important to know is that the march organizers, they actually tried to keep things peaceful. Their original plan, as you can see, was to march all the way to the city center. But they knew the army would block them, so they changed the route at the very last minute to end inside the nationalist Bogside area. But as often happens, a splinter group of marchers kept going toward those army barriers, pretty much looking for a confrontation. And, well, that's exactly where the trouble started. At one of the army barriers, some folks in the crowd started throwing stones, bottles, whatever they could find. The soldiers responded with what was pretty standard crowd control at the time: rubber bullets, CS gas, and a water cannon. It was tense, for sure, but it was still basically within the lines of a typical riot for that era. But this is the critical moment. This is the pivot where everything goes horribly wrong. The commander on the ground, Brigadier McClellan, he gives a very clear, very specific order for a limited arrest operation, just to scoop up the rioters. And crucially, he explicitly forbids his troops from chasing people down Rossville Street, where thousands of peaceful marchers were. But Lieutenant Colonel Wilford, commanding the elite parachute regiment, he disobeyed that order. And this map just shows you the devastating results of that disobedience. Instead of a small, contained operation, Colonel Wilford sent his paratroopers in armored vehicles, charging deep into the Bogside, an area they saw as enemy territory. They weren't just arresting a few rioters anymore. They were driving at high speed straight into crowds of terrified, fleeing civilians. In the space of about 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, the shooting was over. 13 civilians were dead or dying in the streets. A 14th person would die later from their injuries. For decades, the official story from the army was that their soldiers were firing back at IRA gunmen and nail bombers. But then, in 2010, after this massive, exhaustive investigation called the Saville Inquiry, the truth finally came out, and it was damning. It found that the firing was completely unjustified, stating, and I'm quoting here, "None of the casualties was posing a threat of causing death or serious injury. In no case was any warning given before soldiers opened fire. The victims were unarmed." So we know what happened. The events of that day are painfully clear. But the much harder question is, why? Why did Northern Ireland get to this point in the first place? Well, academics have been debating this for years, and they've basically landed on two major schools of thought.
And these two ways of seeing the conflict, they aren't just for history books. They really help us understand the kind of mindsets that were at play on Bloody Sunday itself. On one side, you have a conflict of ideas. On the other, a conflict of identity.
So the ideas argument basically says, look, this wasn't really an ethnic or a religious conflict at its heart. Instead, it was a political struggle, a clash between two totally incompatible visions of democracy. Unionists believed in the democratic idea of majority rule within Northern Ireland, but nationalists believed in the democratic idea of self-determination for the entire island of Ireland. So one group saw the border as legitimate and the other saw it as an artificial line preventing their nation from being whole. Now, the identity argument pushes back and says, hold on a second, you can't just ignore the ethnic and cultural stuff. These scholars agree that the political ideas mattered, of course, but they argue that the real reason things got so explosive was because those cultural differences were supercharged by real-world inequalities. We're talking about discrimination in housing, in jobs, in policing, in political power. They say the state itself was seen as protecting and enforcing the dominance of one group over the other. And listen, this isn't just some dusty academic debate. Understanding these root causes is absolutely critical, because as we're about to see, the past in Northern Ireland, well, it's never really past. The struggle to deal with events like Bloody Sunday is still very much alive today. Just take a look at this timeline. It's staggering. It took 38 years, almost 4 decades, to get the official truth of what happened on Bloody Sunday. And even after that, the road to any kind of real justice has been incredibly rocky. Just last year, in 2023, the UK government passed this hugely controversial thing called the Legacy Act. And what's really incredible here is how everybody hated it. This wasn't a nationalist versus unionist thing. This act basically shut down any new inquests or prosecutions for killings during the Troubles. It was condemned by all 5 main political parties in Northern Ireland and by victims' families from all sides of the conflict. They saw it as a blanket amnesty, a way to shut the door on their right to justice. The outcry was so huge that new proposals have now been put forward to completely scrap that act. And as you can see, they pretty much reverse all the most hated parts, restarting inquests, getting rid of that conditional immunity, and setting up new bodies with the goal of, and this is their phrase, maximum truth, justice, and accountability. It's yet another attempt to finally try and heal the wounds of the past. Which leaves us with this final massive question. How can a society ever truly reconcile when the past isn't even past? It's still right here, in the present. The story of Bloody Sunday is a powerful, painful reminder of how a single event can send shockwaves down through generations, shaping politics, identity, and the very possibility of peace. And finding a way to deal with that legacy in a way that's acceptable to everyone remains Northern Ireland's greatest challenge.